provide financing in some way. Now, we discussed earlier that the issue about tariffs, as opposed to, say, a production subsidy, which is less distorting to the economy, the production subsidy actually requires the government to spend money, which it may not have, where a tariff actually provides the government with some revenue. So definitely not a first best solution, but may very well be a second best solution. The problem of appropriability recognizes the difference between private benefits and social benefits. Again, something that we've talked about earlier. So if there are lots of benefits that accrue to the broader economy or the broader country that can't be captured or adequately compensated by the private business, then the business is going to undertake less of that activity than it normally would. And again, there's a justification for a government intervention. Let me just give you one example of that kind of a benefit. Suppose you decided to start a small manufacturing activity in a developing country. Now, your workers need to be trained to do whatever it is that they're going to do, right? So, but once you have trained them, remember that's a private cost to the company. The worker now has the ability to say, wow, now I got all this training. Maybe I'll go work for another company who's willing to pay me more money because I now have this training that you've provided me. Oh, by the way, thank you very much, but he's going to pay me more, so I'm out the door. We know in those kinds of, and by the way, this happens in developing countries a lot. Labor can move within relatively short areas. There's not the kind of migration that we typically see in developed countries, but any training goes out the door with the workers. And in the beginning of an industrializing situation, those trained workers become highly valuable. And so, again, early on, you won't have as much training taking place because the private costs are greater than, or the private costs are too great relative to the private benefits. So the appropriability can be an issue too. And again, these are, once again, just special cases of our domestic market failure situation. Now, when we talked about domestic market failures earlier, we also said, one of the problems is, how do we decide which industries? I mean, I've always been intrigued, for instance. We know that both Bangladesh and Pakistan, as examples, are labor-abundant countries, and that, therefore, their comparative advantage would be in relatively low-skilled, labor-intensive products. And in fact, both countries do have small manufacturing sectors that are specializing in low-skilled, labor-intensive products. But in fact, Bangladesh dominates, in a relative sense, the market for hats, baseball hats. So if you get a baseball hat, look, there's a good chance that it was made in Bangladesh. On the other hand, Pakistan, completely different industry. Same sort of comparative advantage in terms of labor abundancy and skill sets and that. Pakistan is one of the world's leading producers and exporters of bed sheets. Bed sheets, hats. Who figured out those things? Right? So if you've got government policy trying to figure it out, now you're asking a government bureaucrat to try and pick an industry. If you leave it to the marketplace, you're asking entrepreneurs to do that. Somebody who has a vested interest in making sure that they make the right choice and that they actually continue to operate the industry in a capable way. The second big issue is what we call policy capture. So policy capture just means that once you put a policy in place, you also create beneficiaries of that policy. And those beneficiaries are generally a fairly small group with large benefits, where the cost of that policy is generally widely diffused and the average cost per person is relatively low. Does this sound familiar? And so those who benefit from the policy have a major stake in maintaining the policy status quo, so that the policy itself gets captured by the industry, and that temporary import protection becomes not so temporary. I don't know if I mentioned it to you in this class as opposed to the other class. I don't remember what I say in one versus the other. Alexander Hamilton, first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, proposed in 1792 that we have tariffs on imported iron and steel. Because while we produced a lot of iron ore, we mostly shipped all the iron ore to England. They processed all the iron ore and sent the finished steel back to the United States. So his idea was, well, my goodness, we can make it just as well as they can, and this will help our manufacturing industry. The last tariff on the steel industry came down in 2008. Now, there have been periods of time when we didn't have tariffs on steel, but the fact of the matter is we've had tariffs on the steel industry or other trade protections involving steel or the broader iron ore industry for the better part of 200 years. So one has to be careful about putting a policy in place that protects a particular group that's intended to be temporary, because if you get policy capture, it ends up being much more permanent. Now, a couple of things about import substitution policies, and these were widely followed in the developing world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, probably the leading country arguing for this approach was India. So a couple of things about import substitution. The first is, we did develop manufacturing industries, domestic manufacturing industries. There's no doubt about that. All the countries that did this in any sort of significant way kept out manufactured imports and developed domestic manufacturing industries. It turns out, however, that the economic development, remember the whole goal here was to have faster economic growth. That didn't happen. Now, there were a few exceptions to this, but very few. The overwhelming evidence suggests that import substituting industrialization did work to create a manufacturing sector. So it was, by definition, stronger than the non-existing manufacturing sector that was there before the import substituting industrialization policies were adopted, but it didn't really result in faster economic growth. So, of course, this also belies the fact that a strong manufacturing sector may be necessary for faster economic growth, but it's not a sufficient condition. Simply having a manufacturing sector isn't going to always lead to faster economic growth. Well, why not? Well, for one reason, the domestic manufacturing industries typically were not very competitive. This, by the way, was true even in relatively low-skilled, labor-abundant manufacturing industries. And part of the reason is that comparative advantage is more than just having labor abundancy in this particular case. You also need to have some sort of entrepreneurial spirit, right? You got to have the entrepreneurs who are going to figure out which industries that they ought to be in. You also need some managerial talent. How do we actually organize the company to make sure that we've got the inputs of raw materials coming in? If it's a semi-processed good, that we've got the companies that we're feeding our goods to at the other end. If it's a finished good, how we distribute that throughout the country. How do we have the right kind of pricing, the right kind of cost structure? All of those things become more and more important, especially in a developing country. The second problem with ISI policies was that it typically led to production at an inefficiently small scale. So think of the typical developing country over the last 50 years. Typical, by the way, is not China, and typical is not India, that have 1 billion people or more, right? The typical developing country in the 1950s or 1960s had populations that were 25 million or smaller. These are very small markets. And so you've got small markets, which means that if you have an industry that does have economies of scale, you don't get to enjoy them, right? You just don't have a big enough market to take advantage of any economies of scale. In fact, you may fracture the industry enough, that is, or consolidate, I guess fracture is not the right word. You might actually end up with a consolidated industry that only has 1 or 2 or 3 main producers in it because the market is so small. Remember, you're only producing for your domestic market, not for the export market at this stage. So if you're only producing for your domestic market and you can start consolidating the number of firms in the industry, you move away from that perfect competition, more towards imperfect competition, where each firm is now a price setter, selling at a higher price and producing a smaller quantity, less efficient scale of production. So that can also lead to all sorts of problems. It also turned out that the kinds of policies that were put in place included not just tariffs, not just import quotas, but all sorts of other rules and regulations that were in place. So we might have local content requirements. We may have different types of tariffs on different stages of production if we needed to import raw materials. We might have different tariffs on goods that we can't produce, but we still need to import, even manufactured goods. Very few developing countries ever said, oh, I think I'll start a computer industry, because they knew that they didn't have the talent and the skill sets to do that, so they were still going to have to import computers in order to run the kinds of things that they needed computers for. Well, what kind of tariff and rules and regulations do you have around that? So here's just some of the effective rates of protection in manufacturing for a variety of different countries, and you can see these are the early to mid-1960s. So Mexico actually wasn't so bad at 26%, but Pakistan, we're talking, remember, this is an effective rate of protection of 271%. Remember, the effective rate of protection gives us the percentage between the tariff-ridden price, or at least the trade policy-ridden price, and the free trade price. So you're talking prices here that are almost 3 times higher than the world price. That is a huge loss of consumer surplus. Now, just to give you an idea, there was an article in the New York Times yesterday or the day before, can't remember, talking about tariffs in Japan. And the article was entitled, Fear of Free Trade. And it was specifically talking about trade in rice. So the tariff rate, the nominal rate, I'm assuming since rice is pretty much a primary product, it's also the effective rate of protection, 777.7%. So I'm assuming there's something magic about the number 7 in Japan, but 777.7% tariff rate on rice. So, I mean, we can look at developing countries and see these types of things, but we also have, in some cases, very, very unusual tariff rates in the developed world as well. Now, the other issue is that import substitution, by promoting one industry over another, right, manufacturing over agriculture or over natural resources, is also going to shift resources around within the country, and can end up leading to all sorts of other kinds of issues. Income inequality, you're developing in some parts of the country, but not in other parts of the country. We see this, by the way, even if you have an export bias to your development strategy. But there can be all sorts of other issues that may come up as well. So the 50s and 60s were sort of when the ISI trade policies really kind of hit their peak. Most developing countries during this period of time followed ISI types of policies. But it also became increasingly clear that they were falling further and further behind on an income per person basis the developed countries. So the developed countries already had strong manufacturing bases, or were rebuilding strong manufacturing bases after the destruction of World War II, and they were growing more rapidly than the developing countries. Now we know, if you start way behind, you ought to be catching up. So that didn't actually happen very much. So by the 1970s, ISI trade policies were beginning to fall away. And it led, by the mid-1980s, to a huge shift towards trade liberalization. And it's not exactly clear what the tipping point was. It doesn't look like there was some major event or big conference that said, oh, let's all get together and realize this doesn't work very well. Why don't we try something else? That's not what happened. Countries started to experiment on their own by getting rid of some of these tariffs and import quotas and other trade restrictions, and they saw different things happening to their economies. So it really was a period from an international trade perspective of lots of experimentation. Now, we can see that between the 80s and the 90s that effective rates of protection changed dramatically. So this is just India and Brazil, but this is also pretty much representative of a wide variety of developing countries. So trade policies got slashed left and right here in terms of trying to do this. 2 things happened. All of a sudden there was a huge acceleration in the volume of trade. This is an acceleration relative to GDP growth. So trade was becoming increasingly important as a percentage of overall economic activity. There was also a big change in the composition of trade. So for developing countries, this was away from primary products and towards more manufactured goods. And for the developed countries, it was actually away from manufactured goods and towards more services. So we had both of those kinds of phenomena going on. So this is imports and exports as a percent of developing countries' GDP. You can see roughly 15%, up from 12.5% in the pre-75 period, and then we've had a very nice acceleration up to about 35%. Remember, though, the whole goal of trade liberalization, economic development, not trade in and of itself. Now, one of the reasons for this trade liberalization, even though there was no tipping point, was the recognition that there were a number of Asian countries that had managed to actually create world competitive export industries. World competitive export industries. So now the whole idea was to think, okay, if we can't get our economic growth by limiting our imports and developing a domestic manufacturing sector, would there be a way in which we could encourage our exports of manufactured goods? Now remember, we still have to have all the same domestic market failures as a reason for having a government intervention here. But we want to think about this export-oriented industrialization for the next few minutes. So this was actually recognized on the back of what is known as the high-performance or high-performing Asian economies. And they fall into three groups. The first of those groups, the first in that grouping, is Japan. Now, Japan saw very rapid growth from roughly 1950 to 1990. Very rapid economic growth and very rapid growth on the export side, starting with relatively labor-abundant, low-skilled labor-abundant manufactured goods, but quickly over this 4-year period, moving up the value-added chain to increasingly high value-added types of products, which is kind of what we think of Japanese exports now. The Japanese experience in terms of its export ability to generate economic growth, if there was a single cause for sort of import substituting industrialization to sort of collapse, it was the Japanese experience. Fairly large country in terms of population, actually promoting exports and doing it in a way that generated a manufacturing sector so that it grew very quickly. Now notice the Japanese growth didn't actually start in 1950, it was actually more closer to 1955 or 56, but it lasted for a long time before people realized ISI was not particularly working all that well, but Japan's export-led growth was. And so that sort of became the catalyst. We then saw what are sometimes referred to as the four tigers, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore, and their period of rapid economic growth started in the late 1960s, mid to late 1960s, and basically went through 2000. These countries are still growing relatively rapidly, but the rate of growth has slowed actually quite dramatically over the last 10 years compared to what we saw on average for the previous 35 or 40 years. So notice that, again, this started before sort of the ISI policies were kind of thrown on the rubbish heap. So there was some additional recognition that if these countries, similar in many ways, but also very, very different in other ways, could grow very quickly, maybe other developing countries in other parts of the world could grow along the same lines. So as you probably know, Hong Kong and Singapore are basically city-states, so they're really small in terms of populations. So they were kind of special cases that most countries didn't seem to sort of identify with. But Taiwan and South Korea were kind of your typical size, population-wise, of what we might expect a developing country to look like. Not only that, South Korea had been war-ravaged from the Korean War. Taiwan had not, but Taiwan was also undergoing tremendous amount of social upheavals because of the movement of Chinese residents to the island. So we had that going on during that period of time. And then the final group, China, Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia, and this is a much more heterogeneous group of countries. These growth rates really began in the late 1970s, and it's really hard to say. China is still growing, obviously, very rapidly. Indonesia is not, at least not at its former pace. Thailand's up and down, depends on how much political unrest they're having, which is quite a bit right now. And Malaysia is still growing quite rapidly as well. So again, you'll notice that these countries started to kick in, and China actually didn't kick in until the late 80s, early 90s, but these countries also sort of built on the same kind of model, if you will, or economic policies that we saw in Japan in the 1950s and 60s, and in the tiger countries in the 1960s and the 1970s. So emulating those who have already been successful seemed to be a really nice strategy for the latecomers. Now, there are some things that we can say. All of these countries have very high growth rates. Now, when I talk about very high growth rates, most of you are probably aware that China has gone for almost 20 years now, averaging almost 10% growth, something that no other country has ever accomplished. But these other countries have also seen very rapid growth. Japan's growth from the late 1950s to 1990 averaged about 7.5% per year. That's an average. And when we look at Taiwan and South Korea, they also have very rapid growth rates of about 6.5 or 7% for 30 years. So we're talking about very, very rapid growth rates. Just put that in perspective. Average growth rate in the United States during that period of time has been a little over 3%. So we're talking orders of difference here. A second thing that we can say about these countries is they were very open to international trade. They all had pretty high exports to GDP ratios or imports to GDP ratios. And because of this, this is sometimes referred to as the East Asian miracle or economic miracle. And it clearly pointed out that import substitution industrialization was not the only way to rapid economic growth. In fact, it showed a very different alternative. Rather than concentrating on import substitution, let's concentrate on export support. A couple of questions we might ask. How free was a free trade, and how much difference did that make? How laissez-faire, or government hands-off policy, was there, and how much of a difference did that make?